A couple of announcements. This is the first semester that we run this class Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it appears that cannot get through the chapter 10 notes in 2 classes as per the syllabus. So I've got some work to do this afternoon, deciding whether I'm going to add an extra class on Friday for chapter 10, or whether I'm going to give you guys responsibility for looking at a couple of the last sections in chapter 10. So please make sure to check your email this afternoon. I hope that I will email you before I leave today to let you know whether or not we're going to start chapter 11 on Friday or not. Okay? So make sure that you double check. Also, once I've made that decision, I will rejig the syllabus and I'll put up a new version of the schedule so that you know what's going on for the rest of the semester. Okay? They've got the final exam schedule up now, so I can put the day and the time that the last exam will be during finals week. So there'll be information there for the rest of the semester. All right? What else? Playground people. Next week, bless you. Bless you.
Thank you.
Next week, we start you guys doing playground setups. So make sure that you check the lab blackboard. The partnerships will be up, and the schedule for when you're going to be responsible, and there'll be there's already a document up there to tell you what's going on, but I'll also remind you, you can come and get the keys.
This will be next week?
Come and get the keys. If you want to go look at the toys in the shed to make some decisions about what you're going to do. Alright? So make sure, it's really important that you check Blackboard this afternoon through the rest of the week to get any information that's there, because if you're the ones that are meant to be teaching next week, you need to know what's going on. Alright? Okay, Patrick. Nathan B. Erica. Dave here. Danielle. Jonas. Jerry. Emma. Sam. Scott. All right. So let's see how much further we can get through this sensory perception info. We were looking at understanding three-dimensional space on Monday, and we said that in order to be able to perceive space, we have to be able to perceive depth and distance. All right, and remember that our brains get a mostly two-dimensional image through the stimulus from the visual sensory organ and in the retina. And so then our brain has several mechanisms by which it can infer a three-dimensional scenario. All right? So if we look at infants initially, all right, what we think is that we have to have some experience to develop space perception. All right, so we know obviously that if it's a typically developing infant, child is born with the mechanics for retinal disparity, right? We're not born with our eyes in the middle of our head and they migrate out to the sides of our head. We're born with them spaced out already. And motion parallax, seeing images move backwards and forwards, the retina is working when we're born. So all the mechanical information is there. Right? Everything we need in order to be able to see three-dimensional space is there, but we don't have that experience. Our brain can't interpret a two-dimensional image without experience to know that it's actually three dimensions. Right? So that we think that that's what's going on. Now we know that by 6 months old, infants can perceive depth, and that seems to develop and get better until we get to adolescence. So until we're teenagers, we're constantly tweaking our ability to perceive depth. And we know this because there's some research using a tool that they call the visual cliff. So they have a table with a glass top, and it has a checkerboard underneath it. And halfway across the table, they take the checkerboard away and it runs down the side of the table and then along the floor. If you take an infant, within the first few days that they start self-locomoting, so if they're belly crawling or if they've started to creep, and in those first few days that they started that behavior, you put them on the table, and mum stands on the other side of the table with a toy, they will go straight across the table to mum. Okay? But what we see with infants who have experience of crawling, so give them 2-3 weeks and put them back on the table, they crawl and they get to the edge, to the drop-off, which isn't a real drop-off, right, because we've got the glass top, but it looks like a drop-off. After 3 weeks or so of practice and moving around, now they go to crawl across the table and they get to the edge and they go, whoa, and they look at mum, and sometimes they get quite upset because mum has the toy, but they can't get to mum now because they see the cliff that they did not see in the first few days. So the experience of self-locomoting teaches their brain about depth. And if you work with children in elementary school, that age group, when does middle school start? What age are you when you start middle school? 11. So even in middle school, you would still see improvements in depth perception. So think about your sport. When do you use depth perception in sport?
Judging the ball.
Judging a ball. Right? So if I'm going to hit a ball or I'm going to catch a ball, I need to be able to tell where it is. What about high jump? Or pole vault, right? I would have to be able to judge where the bar is to know how much pull I want to put on the pole to ping myself over the top of the bar. Okay? So think about how would I achieve those skills if we didn't learn depth perception. As we get older, right, at your age, depth perception is adult-like, mature, and that's going to be just fine until you get into your late 40s, bless you, into your late 40s or your 50s, and what you'll find is starts to get more and more difficult. So we said the other day that nighttime driving becomes harder for older people because the lights start to sparkle and you get very fuzzy information about the depth of the car in front of you. How far away is the car in front of you? Becomes very difficult as you get older when you're driving at night. It's okay in the day, in bright sunlight, you don't have any trouble, but as the light dims and you get less and less information, it becomes tricky to make those judgment calls, right? So you'll see that as you get older, depth perception becomes a little bit difficult, particularly in dim light. Right? What we notice the older you get, more and more people start to fail if they take a depth perception test when they go to get their eyes checked. Right? But the belief is that it's not the brain's ability necessarily to perceive, it's not the understanding, it's not the interpretation, but the information itself. Think back to those pictures that we had, right? The information itself starts to deteriorate. So the retina breaks down a little bit, or the nerve that comes from the retina to the visual cortex starts to degrade, or the level of chemicals that are available to transmit the electrical impulse changes, right? So the information, or the actual eye structure starts to deteriorate, right? So the information that the brain starts to receive is degraded, and that affects our ability to perceive depth. So disease might impact if I develop age-related macular degeneration, that one where the periphery stays clear but the central area gets blurry, or anatomical facial changes. So if I have a stroke, perhaps, and the left side of my face, the muscles don't work very well, and that would skew the way the muscles work in the eye, on the cornea, and that might change the kind of information that my brain is receiving. So, you can go online, it's really easy. Let's see if we can find one. It's quite fun watching these children do this. Let's see. As if we put in visual clip. Would help if I did do that. Thank you. There we go. What we want is a bit of film. YouTube, there we go. That's what we want. So for us as adults, we see a drop-off. It's like, yeah, I'm not so sure. Let's see. Ooh. All right? If you had looked at her earlier, she would have gone across the table to Mum. Right? So it's quite a fun, I saw at a conference one time, a piece of film that I've never managed to find online, where the child got to the edge and looked at its mum, and it wanted the toy so bad, it went over to the side of the table and grabbed the ledge and crept along the ledge to get around to the toy. It was hysterical. It was very funny. So that gives us a good idea of what the brain is learning once we start to move. So moving is really crucial to all kinds of concepts that we know as we're growing up. All right, so I can see depth, maybe, right? I've learned the depth. And the example that we were talking about earlier was catching a ball. How do I know it's a ball? How do I recognize the ball? Right? So not only do I have to be able to perceive depth, I have to be able to perceive characteristics about an object and identify the object. Right? So some of the major characteristics, attributes that we learn about objects are size, shape, and motion. Okay, and visual perception is based upon information about the edges of something. So if you think about, let's do a soccer goalie, right? So if I'm running down the field with the ball, and the goalie is in front of the goal, how do I know he's in front of the goal and not behind the goal, other than the fact that he couldn't do the job if he was behind the goal, right? But visually, how do I know he's in front of the goal?
Because he obstructs what's behind.
Because he obstructs what's behind him, right? Well, if you think about that logically, okay, what you see is the edge of the goalie and the stopping edge of the goal, right? So what we have to learn is which edge belongs to which object. Do you think that the goal object stops at the person and then starts again the other side? Right? So if I'm coming down the field with the ball and my person is here, right? And my goal, does it stop and then start again the other side? No, right? So the fact that we know the goal is still there at the back means that he has to be in front of the goal. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? It's not something we think about because we're adults and you've got loads of practice at it. Right? If I'm standing here, you don't think that the whiteboard disappears behind me. You know it's still there. That means I'm in front of the board. Right? But your brain had to learn that when you were little. It's not something we know when we're born, it's something we learn by moving. So we learn about edges. Remember our haptic information, when we mentioned haptic information earlier in the semester, one of the things that we can learn by touching an object is the edges of the object. Right? So by using haptic information, by playing with toys, squishing toys, rubbing toys, touching toys, we learn about edges. And then once we know about edges, then we can start to define whether the edge is the boundary of something or not the boundary. So this edge of the goal net is not the boundary of the goal net, because the goal net continues behind the person. But the boundary of the person, the edge of the person is that person's boundary, right? It's the edge of the object. So all the time we're moving, that information is something your brain is interpreting and understanding. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to move around in our environment. Right? We wouldn't know. So understanding edges and boundaries allows us to perceive one thing we can tell is figure ground that are embedded together. So if you remember, maybe when you were younger, you did puzzle books or the newspaper puzzles with your grandparents or your parents. Right? Sometimes we get those puzzles where they say, how many candy canes are there in the picture? Right? Well, the way we can identify the candy cane in the picture is because we can tell the boundary of the candy cane. If we put that into a sport context, one factor in home advantage in sport is the fact that we practice in that environment all the time. And so it's very easy for you to identify the ball against the background in your own environment, because you see it every day, right? You're in there practicing it every day. When you go to a new environment, when you play away, your brain has to spend a little bit of time learning what the ball looks like against different backgrounds. It always amazes me when they let people sit behind a goal in any sport with those big foam finger things, because that changes the background. Now it's very easy to lose the ball against that. Okay. It's not the only reason you get a home advantage. There's lots of reasons, but it's one of the reasons for home advantage. Right? It makes it's just a little bit harder when you go to a new stadium to pick the ball out clearly. It takes a little bit of practice. If you don't get there early enough and you don't get enough practice, that can be a bit hard sometimes. Okay. Lose the ball. Another thing we can learn once we've got edges and boundaries sorted out is whole and part perception. So the picture, part of a picture can be discriminated from the whole. So one of the things they do to test that, if they show these kinds of pictures to younger children, they see, for example, either the face, or either the bunny rabbit, or the banana, the pear, the apple, the carrot. Okay. As you get older, and as adults, you say, oh, there's a bunny rabbit that is made up of fruits and vegetables. Because you can distinguish whole and part and integrate them. But when we're young, before we've learned that, you would pick one or the other. You'd either pick the rabbit or you'd pick the fruit and vegetable. Right? So it takes your brain time to learn about these boundaries and be able to integrate and switch backwards and forwards. All right, so when we're young then, before we've learned these edges, young infants, when they initially start to reach and grasp for things or play with a toy or start trying to roll and reach, then what we think is that they maybe use the depth that they're starting to learn and the movement of the toy. So it takes a little bit of time for them to start to learn about the boundaries and the edges in relation to moving around. Right? The refining of these ideas, figure ground perception and whole part perception, continues up until around 9 years old. So we see improvements in young children's ability to tell the difference. Okay? If I'm looking at a car and there's a pair of feet under the car or a bicycle wheel, doesn't mean the car grew a pair of feet or a bicycle wheel. It means there's someone else the other side of it. Right? So we have to learn that distinction. And it does seem that as adults we're super sensitive to these concepts, way more sensitive than we probably need to be. Although I'm always a little hesitant to say that because I honestly believe that we don't develop something we don't need. So I wonder why we have these really extreme levels of being able to tell. This is difficult when you're here, right, trying to think about this because it's so obvious to you. Right? As adults, we're very, very good at this. What about size constancy? So as the ball flies towards you, so the image on the retina gets bigger, but does it really look like it's getting bigger to you? No, because your brain knows the ball isn't getting bigger, and it manages to maintain.
The understanding the size and shape.
Yes. Right? Understanding the size, so I can maintain size constancy in my picture, even though the actual image on the retina is getting bigger as it gets closer. In an experienced scenario, right? You wouldn't maintain size constancy in a novel scenario. So if you're stuck on the railway track and the train is coming towards you, the train is not going to stay the same size. The picture in your head, the train is going to be getting bigger, right? Because that's a novel situation. But when you catch the ball doesn't get bigger and bigger and bigger as it comes closer. Because you've practiced it a lot and your brain knows the ball isn't getting bigger. Make sense? Right? Let's see. Okay, so where are we? 11:30. All right. Perception of motion. We had 3 different types of visual perceptions. We said perception of space, perception of objects, and we have to be able to perceive motion in order to move and play sport and play games. Right? I've got to know where the ball is, how it's moving, what's going on. And what we find when we look at the brain, so we're getting very clever now at actually watching the brain at work. Right? The equipment is getting more and more sophisticated and allows us to actually watch the brain while we ask it to do something. So what they see, if we put a cap on that has these little electrodes that pick up signals, is that there are specific structures, specific mechanisms within the brain that are dedicated to detect motion. So if I put a ball that is stationary in front of a person, this part of the brain doesn't give a signal. But if I roll the ball side to side or back to front, we start to see certain parts of the brain firing, responding to the stimulus of the ball moving. Okay? So actual individual cells can fire differently depending on whether they're recognizing direction. A different set of cells will fire for location. A different set of cells will fire for speed. All of which you take for granted, right? Because you know where the ball is and how fast it's moving and whether it's going left to right or front to back. Okay. What would you do on a softball field if someone hit the ball and you're out in the field and you can't tell whether the ball is flying left to right or right to left? How would you catch the ball? Of course you can, because you're experienced at it. Okay. So we learn this. When we, again, look at developmental pictures, when we check with infants, they can perceive motion. So they can set up a test to tell whether or not the baby recognizes an object is moving. And they tend to recognize speed a little bit sooner than they recognize direction, right? But they don't have, they're not very sensitive in this. So if, as with a baby, if I move something very, very slowly, right? So I have their toy and I move it really slow, they don't pick up movement. I've got to move it quite dramatically and they recognize that it's moving. And then as we get older, we get more sensitive, right? We get better at detecting very slight movement. Okay? And on the other end of the scale, when we get a lot older, then we start to struggle again. If the strength of the signal, if the strength of the stimulus is only just reaching threshold. So there'll become a point in time where when you move it very slowly, that signal's not quite strong enough for them to pick that up. If I move it quite rapidly, they're okay. So what might that mean in real world? As you get older,
Not able to pick up the car that's rolling up behind you.
very, very possibly, right? If a car is moving very slowly, maybe you wouldn't notice that it was moving very slowly. Or if your most favorite crystal vase is getting jiggled across to the edge of the table very slowly, right? You might not see it until it falls, right? You might not be able to react to that. So when we're passing and catching or striking or kicking, all of those are visual perception tasks, right? I've got to be able to understand the space that it's in. I've got to be able to understand the object. I've got to be able to understand the motion. And so as we learn that, then what we find is that what becomes important is not the perception of the movement, because we've learned that, we understand that. Now my attention to the perception of the movement becomes important. So as an adult, if you're out on the field and you're tired, or you're hungry, or you have a fight with your partner, is it more difficult to catch the ball, hit the ball, kick the ball, than on a day when you're out there and you're really in the zone, you're really focused?
Of course.
Because attention, once we've learned these perceptions, attention to environmental cues and to the object start to become the most important thing. Okay? But when I'm learning, so we don't have any baseball work, softball girls, when you're looking at the ball, okay, do you still pay attention to the seam on the ball? Or do you pay attention to where other people are? To the environment?
Tune it out.
Tune it out. Hopefully you tune it out, right? That's part of why you train, it's part of why you practice is, can I pay attention to the right environmental cues and not the wrong ones?
Can't do that when you catch a putt.
So what about if we can't see then? What happens if we can't see very well? And that information is very poor that we're getting. Alright? So blindness has a continuum. Right? Blindness doesn't only mean I can't see anything at all. That's the most extreme version, all right? Anything from 80% upwards technically classifies you as blind, all right? So you may work at some point with someone who isn't totally blind, but they're technically blind, and that impacts the amount of information their brain is getting visually. When we look at children and young infants and toddlers who are visually delayed or were born with a birth defect in their retina or something like that, then we see some quite large delays because the being curious about what's going on stimulates your desire to want to move over and explore it. Yeah. So if I'm not visually stimulated, if I'm not getting pictures of things around the room that I want to go find out about, then that decreases your motivation to start to or creep. So we see a delay in creeping. Okay, you can have a look at that. So what we need to do, if I've got a child who is not motivated to move, right, because they can't see the toy, so there's no reason for them to try to start creeping to get to the toy or rolling. Right? How can I encourage them to come and try and play with the toy? What can I change in the toy? Noise, right? So we add bells to things, or we can add crinkly paper to stuff. Right? Because if I can make the toy make a noise, that might encourage them to try to get over and find out what the noise is.
Can you change the color, like brighter colors if they're cold?
If they weren't totally blind, that might work. You might find children who are colorblind.
I'm colorblind, I don't see red.
Don't see red?
I really don't.
That's
It's not true.
It's not true. Is he telling Porky's?
I don't know. That's
Nah,
definitely.
yeah, Porky's. All right, so when we look at this table, you can see it isn't that a child or an adult who is blind can't walk, can't move, obviously. But what we see is a significant delay in that population. So if you look at sitting alone, right, somewhere around 6.5 months, a bit earlier. For sighted children, could be as late as 8 months. Right? Standing up, the delay gets a bit bigger here. Right? Walking, if you look at walking, on average for a typical child, around 12 months. On average for an unsighted child, closer to 19 months. Big difference. They're gonna walk, because all humans stand up and walk, typically. Okay? Not all, but most. But they just do it a lot later. Enough? What to